By the end of 1944, the bomber crews of the United States Army Air Forces believed they had already seen the future. They had flown missions with Azon, the first bomb in history that listened to human hands as it fell. They had guided it left and right, watched it drift across the air and strike bridges that no ordinary weapon could hit. For a few brief months, Azon seemed like a miracle. But war always reveals the limits of miracles. The more the crews used Azon, the more they understood the weapon could only do so much. It could shift sideways, but not forward or back. It could correct drift, but not distance. In many missions, the bombardiers found themselves frustrated as they watched a bomb fall slightly too long or too short, unable to pull it toward the target. A bridge could be perfectly aligned in the horizontal plane, yet the bomb would still drop just before it, or just beyond it. Azon had changed the rules of bombing, but it had not rewritten them, and so the engineers began searching for the next step. On a cold morning at Eglin Field in Florida, a small group of officers gathered in a hangar lit only by a few overhead lamps. On the concrete floor in front of them rested a heavy 1,000-pound bomb fitted with a tail assembly unlike anything the airmen had seen. It had larger fins than Azon and a longer frame. The most unusual feature was the flare mount at the rear, a device meant to glow brightly during the bomb's descent so crews could track it at great distance. The officers called the weapon RAZON, an acronym for range and azimuth only. It was designed to do what Azon could not. It could steer left and right. It could also adjust its forward distance during the fall. It was the first bomb in history that could correct its path in 2 dimensions while in free fall. The concept sounded impossible, even to those who had worked on Azon. Vertical correction was the dream of every bombardier. If a bomb could drift left or right, why not allow it to shorten or lengthen its fall? Why not allow it to ride the air for an extra moment or slip downward more quickly? Why not let the bombardier tune the trajectory like a musician adjusting the pitch of a note? The engineers wanted exactly that. They believed that if they could control not just the direction, but the distance of a falling bomb, they would break the last barrier separating conventional bombing from true precision. The earliest tests came with disappointment. When engineers attempted to modify the Azon assembly to allow vertical control, the bomb spun wildly out of balance. The air caught the fins unevenly and sent the weapon tumbling. New gyros had to be designed, new radio links tested, new fin designs shaped and reshaped by hand. Many prototypes fell short, literally smashing into the sand at Eglin Field before the bombardier could even activate control. But slowly the engineers learned something new. A bomb did not need to climb or dive sharply. It only needed to adjust the resistance of its fins. By increasing drag at the rear, the bomb would slow slightly, extending its flight. By reducing drag, the bomb would fall more directly, decreasing its travel. Tiny adjustments in airflow gave the bombardier influence over range. It was not full vertical steering, but it was enough to matter, enough to strike targets that Azon still missed. As the tests continued, the engineers invited select bomber crews to witness the trials. The airmen stood behind sandberms, watching the RAZON test shapes fall from B-29 aircraft high above the field. The bombs left long, glowing trails from the flare packs attached to the tail, allowing everyone to see the corrections. At first, the smoke trails wavered irregularly. Then, on a later test, the bomb shifted left, then slowed subtly, then curved downward in a smooth arc. The airmen muttered in disbelief. They were watching a bomb change both direction and distance while falling. One bombardier whispered that it looked like the bomb was thinking. Another said it looked like it was swimming through the air. When the engineers explained what was happening, they realized they were witnessing a moment as important as the invention of the Norden bomb sight. A weapon that could correct both azimuth and range was not a guided bomb exactly, but it was no longer a free-fall weapon either. It was something new. Something between the old world of dumb bombs and the future world of smart weapons. Something that pointed directly toward the weapons that would one day dominate modern warfare. After the demonstration, the officers invited the bomber crews inside the hangar. They showed them the radio transmitter box, a heavier and more complex version of the Azon control unit. They showed them the new fin servos, the flare tube that allowed the bomb to glow like a falling star, and the small gyroscope assembly that kept the bomb stable while reacting to commands. The bombardiers studied every part of the system. Their profession had always been about precision. They had memorized wind drift tables, bombing tables, and angle corrections. They knew the frustration of watching a bomb fall wide, even when the Norden said the aim was perfect. Now, for the first time in their careers, they saw a weapon that promised to close the gap between mathematics and reality. When the engineers finished their explanation, they stepped aside and let the airmen approach the bomb. The men ran their hands over the fins, the metal still cool from the morning air. One bombardier rested his hand on the flare tube and whispered that it felt like touching the future. In that moment, all of them sensed that Razon was not just a new weapon, but a bridge, a link between the crude freefall bombs of the past and the guided precision weapons that would one day rule the skies. Azon had opened the door. Razon was about to walk through it. And the men standing in that hangar did not yet know it, but they were witnessing a moment as important as the invention of the Norden bomb sight. The development of Razon did not begin with a dramatic announcement or a classified order stamped urgent. It began in rooms that smelled of oil and ozone, inside workshops where technicians worked under buzzing fluorescent lamps and scribbled calculations on blackboards stained with chalk dust. The engineers who built it were not seeking fame. Most of them had no idea they were creating the ancestor of every smart bomb that would follow. They only knew that Azon was a beginning and not an end. If a bomb could steer sideways, the next question was obvious. Could it steer in depth as well? Could a pilot change not only the left or right drift, but the very reach of the bomb along its fall? Could he shorten the distance or extend it? Could he correct overshoot or undershoot before gravity locked the bomb into failure? These were the questions that brought the engineers together in the winter of 1944 at Orlando Army Airfield and Eglin Field. There, the air vibrated with the constant hum of test engines and the sharp metallic clatter of tools. The workshops were filled with experimental tails, motors, servos, and test racks holding the heavy steel casings of 1,000-pound bombs. Early experiments were crude. Technicians bolted oversized fins to bomb casings, trying to find a balance between stability and control. But every time they added vertical adjustments, the bombs behaved like wounded birds, tumbling end over end. Vertical steering required more than just changing fin angles. It required a way to regulate fall speed. That was where the breakthrough came. Instead of forcing the bomb to pitch upward or downward, a motion that created violent instability, the engineers learned they could influence the bomb's range by manipulating drag. Increase drag and the bomb would slow gently, allowing it to fall slightly shorter than its natural path. Reduce drag and the bomb would slip more directly toward the ground, increasing its reach. These adjustments were small, but powerful enough to give a bombardier control over range. Not full vertical steering, but meaningful influence. The foundation of the smart weapons era was being laid quietly, one calculation at a time. In one test, a bomb fitted with the new drag control system fell smoothly until the bombardier issued a command to lengthen its reach. Observers on the ground watched the glowing flare at the tail twitch slightly as the fins adjusted. The bomb fell a little longer than expected, but not wildly so. The airmen cheered, not because the bomb hit its target perfectly, but because it had responded. It had listened and obeyed. What followed were long months of refinement. Engineers rebuilt the fin assemblies, forging them from sturdier alloys and reshaping the control surfaces to handle turbulent air at high speeds. They embedded stronger servos, capable of shifting fins under tremendous pressure. They redesigned the radio receiver housing to shield it from buffeting wind. They also created a flare system that was brighter than anything used before. Azon used small reflectors to keep the bomb visible. Razon used a burning flare chute that produced a trailing streak of bright light like a falling star. Bombardiers testing the system at Eglin Field described the sight as unforgettable. They would sit inside the nose of a B-29, watching the world below blur into a sea of green and brown, while a bright orange trail glided downward beneath them. The flare revealed every motion of the bomb, every correction, every adjustment. In those tests, the Bombardier held a new control box, a larger transmitter with range switches and the familiar azimuth joystick. The transmitter fit awkwardly beside the Norden bomb sight. It had dials, knobs, and a flickering indicator light that blinked each time a command was sent. Training sessions lasted hours. Bombardiers practiced issuing quick corrections, then long ones, alternating between left, right, shorten, extend. They had to learn the rhythm of the bomb, its lag time, the delay between command and movement, and the feel of control under pressure. One test pilot said that commanding a raison bomb felt like talking to a stubborn horse. You had to know when to nudge and when to wait. Too much movement, too fast, and the bomb would wobble, struggling to stabilize. Just enough movement, though, and the bomb would glide elegantly, trading height for distance or distance for alignment. The engineers videotaped many tests using early cameras mounted under observation balloons. These grainy films showed the bombs falling in long arcs, their flare tails marking the air. Azon bombs left simple lines. Raison bombs left curves. Those curves would one day become the signature of every guided bomb in modern arsenals. One of the engineers, a thin man with wireframe glasses, later recalled the moment he realized what they were creating. During a test, the Bombardier made several small corrections, guiding the bomb over a riverbed. The flare streak bent subtly as the bomb adjusted its range. The engineer whispered to the officer beside him, "If we can control this, we can control anything." They did not speak of laser guidance or satellite signals or inertial systems. They spoke only of possibilities. But their work carried a truth no one fully grasped yet. They were dragging the future into the present. The first time a raison bomb successfully obeyed both directional and range commands in the same drop, the normally quiet Eglin Field erupted in applause. Technicians slapped each other on the back. The Bombardier climbed out of the B-29 beaming with pride. The engineers hurried forward with notebooks in hand, ready to record every detail of the flight. Raison had worked. It had not only drifted left and right, it had stretched its fall. It had changed its reach. It had responded to a human hand twice in the same descent. No free-fall bomb in history had ever done that. In the dim glow of that workshop that night, the engineers sat around their blueprints, mapping out improvements. They refined servo positions, adjusted antenna angles, and debated the stability of flare colors. The room buzzed with optimism. They knew the bomb was still primitive, but that did not matter. Raison was the first step beyond the world of simple gravity. The crews who watched from the sidelines sensed something deeper. Azon had given them a glimpse of precision. Raison was giving them control. For the first time, they were not just dropping bombs, they were guiding them. And although the war was nearing its end, these quiet nights in the workshops and hangars were planting the seeds for every smart weapon that would come after.
By mid-1945, the engineers had tested raison in controlled ranges until they could recite every characteristic of the bomb from memory. But no matter how many diagrams they drew or how many practice drops they filmed, the truth remained the same. A weapon is not proven in a laboratory. It is proven in the sky, under fire. And so the task fell to the bomber crews of the Pacific Theater to take raison into combat. They would discover what it could really do. The B-29 Super Fortress crews, stationed on Tinian and Guam, had already grown accustomed to flying some of the longest and most dangerous missions of the war. They had bombed Japan at night, in storms of flak and rising hot air that buffeted the aircraft like a fist. They had seen engines catch fire and aircraft vanish into the dark sea. Now, as they stood in their briefing rooms, they learned they would be carrying something new, Their next target would not be cities or factories, but precise points of infrastructure that required accuracy far beyond ordinary bombs. Bridges in Formosa, power stations feeding Japanese industry, dams whose destruction would cripple supply lines. They were told they would carry raison bombs, a weapon that could correct not only its left and right drift, but also its range. Many of the airmen looked at each other in disbelief. Some had heard rumors of Azon being used in Europe, but raison was something else, something more radical, a bomb that could be guided twice in one fall. The briefing officer explained that each B-29 would carry only a few raison rounds because the bombardier had to concentrate fully on each drop. A second bomb could not be guided until the first one hit. The crews listened carefully as the officer explained the flare at the tail. When the bomb fell, it would leave a bright line across the sky, making every correction visible. The bombardier had to track that flare with unwavering focus. If clouds moved in or sunlight blinded the optics, the mission would fail. As the crews walked across the island toward their aircraft, the air was thick with humidity and the smell of fuel. The raison bombs waited on wooden stands, their fins gleaming under the tropical sun. The flare tubes were sealed until the moment of release, and the bomb casings were stenciled with small symbols indicating the new servo motors inside. Ground crews loaded the heavy weapons into the bomb bays, while the bombardiers climbed into the nose compartments. Inside the aircraft, the airmen checked their radios, their oxygen masks, and the control boxes that would let them steer the bombs. The joysticks felt heavier than the older Azon units, and the range control switches clicked firmly when tested. When the engines roared to life, the tarmac shook beneath them. One by one, the B-29s lifted off, climbing into the bright morning sky. Formation flying was not as tight in the Pacific as it had been over Europe. The long distances required looser groupings, so the bombers spread out over the ocean in staggered layers. The radio remained mostly silent except for altitude checks and weather updates. Hours passed as they crossed endless water. When the coast of Formosa rose ahead, the mood inside each aircraft shifted. Everyone knew the flak here was fierce and well coordinated. The Japanese defenders had perfected the use of heavy guns along coastal ridges. The B-29s approached at altitude. The coastline flashed below them. Then the sky erupted. Flak burst all around the formation, black spheres ripping through the air. The B-29 shook under the pressure, but held course. The bombardier in the lead aircraft leaned over his bomb sight as the target came into view, a long rail bridge spanning a narrow canyon. The commander gave the signal. Bomb bay doors open. Cold wind blasted through the fuselage. The bombardier steadied his breathing. He kept one eye on the sight and the other on the glowing indicator of the range control. This was the moment they had trained for. He flipped the arming switches. The first raison detached cleanly and dropped from the aircraft. As it fell, the tail flare ignited with a bright, steady glow, visible even through the haze. The bombardier activated the guidance link. Instantly, the flare line began to drift slightly left. He moved the joystick to correct it. The flare straightened. Then he checked the range. The bomb was falling slightly short of the intended point. He flipped the drag switch. The flare slowed just a little, an almost imperceptible change, but enough to extend the bomb's travel. He felt something tighten inside him. The bomb was responding to him in 2 dimensions, not just one. More flak erupted below the aircraft. Bursts shook the air, but the bombardier kept his eyes locked on the falling light. He made a second azimuth correction, then lengthened the range again. Each adjustment left a curved streak in the sky where the flare marked the bomb's path. The rail bridge grew larger in the sight. The bombardier issued the final correction and held steady. The bomb hit the center of the span in an eruption of fire, dust, and steel. The crew inside the B-29 erupted in celebration. They had seen Raison work for the first time in combat, and it had worked beautifully. But the missions did not end there. Over the next weeks, Raison was used against power stations and hydroelectric dams. In one mission, the bombardier guided a Raison bomb through swirling crosswinds to strike a narrow spillway. In another, a B-29 crew used range corrections to adjust for sudden downdrafts near a mountain slope, allowing the bomb to fall true when it otherwise would have missed by hundreds of feet. The Japanese defenders were stunned. They reported bombs that seemed to slow in midair, change direction, and then hit with uncanny accuracy. The pilots felt something deeper. They had crossed into new territory. They were no longer just dropping bombs. They were shaping their path, bending them through the air with commands and corrections. In the glow of the falling flares, they saw the birth of something that did not have a name yet. But history would one day call it the beginning of smart weapons.
By the time Raison had completed its first series of missions, the men who flew with it understood they were no longer dealing with a new version of Aizon, but with a different kind of weapon entirely. Aizon had been remarkable because it could shift a bomb sideways, but Raison did something far more profound. It challenged the very idea that a bomb was a slave to gravity. It showed the crews that a falling weapon could be shaped, guided, and corrected long after leaving the aircraft. And once they witnessed that change, they could not go back to the old world of free-fall bombing. In the years before Raison, an airman could only pray that wind drift and altitude errors did not ruin his aim. Even with the Norden bomb sight, a precision strike meant hoping that everything aligned perfectly. But with Raison, the bombardier could fight the air currents, fight the turbulence, and correct mistakes that once would have doomed the mission. The first time this difference became unmistakable was during a strike on a dam feeding a power grid along the Chinese coast. The target was a narrow spillway cut into a mountainside. The Japanese had reinforced it with concrete ribs and ringed it with flak batteries. A bomb dropped even slightly off course would hit rock instead of the narrow slot. No conventional bomb had ever come close. When the B-29 formation approached the target, heavy flak filled the sky and pushed the bombers upward in lurching jolts. The bombardier in the lead aircraft could see the spillway through his sight, but turbulence made the crosshairs dance. In a normal mission, this would have ruined the drop. But he had Raison. He released the bomb and watched the flare ignite. For the first few seconds, the weapon drifted wildly. Then he steadied it, guiding left, then right, then lengthening its fall to compensate for the buffeting winds. The flare trail carved a smooth curve toward the gorge. At the final moment, the bomb dipped perfectly into the spillway and exploded inside the concrete throat of the dam. The blast sent a geyser of water into the air and severed the generating capacity of the entire facility. The bombardier looked away from his sight, stunned by what he had done. He had taken a bomb that should have missed completely and guided it into a gap narrower than the wingspan of his aircraft. Raison had turned a near-impossible shot into a calculated precision strike. Another mission soon followed that further proved the bomb's extraordinary power. Japanese engineers had relocated critical generators to small concrete bunkers buried in hillsides. Their entrances were barely visible from the air. A freefall bomb would simply strike the hillside or miss by a wide margin. Yet the bombardier in a B-29 over the Pacific watched as his Raison bomb drifted smoothly across the terrain. When it began falling short, he increased the drag and lengthened its descent. The flare slowed visibly. Then he nudged the joystick right and watched the flare adjust. The bomb hit the entrance of the bunker with a blast so direct that reconnaissance photographs later showed the ceiling collapsed inward as if someone had placed the bomb at the door. Nothing like this had ever been seen in aerial warfare. Precision was no longer a hope, it was becoming a skill. One bombardier later wrote in his diary that guiding a Raison bomb felt less like dropping a weapon and more like threading a needle from 10,000 feet above the earth. The missions piled up, and each one proved something new. Raison changed the way crews thought about targets. Small bridges no longer required dozens of bombers. One aircraft with one Raison might be enough. Rail choke points, once considered too narrow for high-altitude strikes, became legitimate objectives. Tall structures in difficult terrain could be attacked with confidence because Raison gave bombardiers the ability to adjust after release. They had never had that before. Even the Japanese began to sense something different. Reports retrieved after the war described bombs that seemed to slow and then fall precisely onto the most vulnerable points of a target. Soldiers spoke of flare trails that shifted like living lines of fire. They believed the Americans had developed a weapon guided by invisible signals. They were not wrong. What made Raison truly revolutionary, however, was not any single mission. It was what the weapon represented. It was the first bomb that forced planners to rethink the meaning of accuracy. Before Raison, accuracy was measured by circular error probable, by how close bombs fell to a point on average. After Raison, accuracy meant something else. It meant steering. It meant control. It meant the target was no longer a distant hope, but an achievable final destination. Raison was a small step from the perspective of engineering, but a giant leap in the psychology of warfare. For the first time, bombardiers began asking questions no one had dared to ask before. If we can guide a bomb a little to the left, why not guide it all the way to the target? If we can slow a bomb slightly, why not control its entire descent? If we can adjust 2 axes, why not 3? Why not build a bomb that finds its target without human control? The engineers did not yet have the answers. The war was ending and resources were shifting. But the idea was planted, and once planted, it refused to die. What Raison proved on the battlefield became the foundation for everything that followed. Precision was no longer a dream. It was a capability. And though the bomb was produced in limited quantities and arrived too late to be widely used, its impact rippled far beyond the runways where it was loaded or the skies where it fell. Raison showed that a bomb did not have to fall blindly. It could be guided. It could be corrected. It could obey. And that realization, more than any single explosion, marked the moment when air warfare stepped from the age of falling steel into the age of thinking weapons. By the time the last Raison missions were flown, the war was winding toward its end, and the airfields that once buzzed with urgency had begun to quiet. Crews rotated home. Squadrons disbanded. The world was already looking beyond victory toward rebuilding. And because history often remembers what is loudest, not what is first, Raison slipped quietly into obscurity. It had never existed in large numbers. It had never been deployed on a massive scale. It had appeared late in the war when attention had shifted to surrender negotiations and the dawn of the atomic age. Yet any airman who ever gripped the Raison control box understood that they were holding something far more important than its modest combat record suggested. They were holding the seed of every guided weapon that would come after. For decades before Raison, bombing was governed entirely by gravity, ballistics, and luck. After Raison, bombing moved toward intention, control, and design. It bridged the world of falling steel and the world of thinking weapons. That is why many historians now call it the first true step into the smart weapons era. Not the laser bombs, not the satellite bombs, not the computer-guided bombs. A simple radio-controlled finned weapon with a bright flare burning at its tail, falling through the air while a bombardier guided it with his hands. The image that remains strongest is one remembered by a veteran bombardier decades later. He described sitting in the glass nose of a B-29, with the sun rising over the wing, the ocean glinting below, and a Raison flare glowing like a second sun as it traced its path downward. He said that in that moment he felt as though he was holding the future between his fingers. And he was right. Raison did not end a war. It did not flatten cities or force surrenders. But it changed the sky. It changed the meaning of accuracy. It changed what bombs could do. And from that change came every smart weapon that followed. Raison was the quiet beginning of a revolution, the bridge between the past and everything that would come after.